From the Historyogi podcast, this is Dave. The South China Sea dispute has gained increasing prominence in recent years, with China being especially aggressive with its claims. Today, we speak to Dr. Collin Koh, Research Fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, on some basic questions about the dispute. We discuss its history, the significance of the Nine Dash Line, the actions of various claimant states as well as the United States, ASEAN's lack of unity, the feasibility of a code of conduct, the role of Chinese fishing fleets, and the stakes for a non-claimant state like Singapore. Thank you very much, Dr. Koh, for joining us today. Could you just share with us what is the South China Sea dispute all about?
Oh yes, the South China Sea dispute basically covers largely the differences between the South China Sea littoral states, namely China, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Philippines, and Brunei, in terms of the differences in their maritime sovereignty and rights. It's very important to put a disclaimer here. We distinguish between claimants and non-claimants. It is a very complex issue in the South China Sea where China and the rest of the Southeast Asian countries that I mentioned, except Indonesia, will regard themselves as claimants. But Indonesia itself doesn't recognize itself as a claimant to the dispute, and thereby it has a lot to do with the fact that it does not recognize China's Nine Dash Line claim in that regard. So it's largely about maritime sovereignty and rights. But in today's context, most of the claimants that we're talking about largely would not try to touch very much on the sovereignty aspect. For the lay reader, we talk about sovereignty, we are largely referring to things that is physical, something you can claim, is terrestrial in nature. So we are largely referring to the land features that you can find in the South China Sea of various sizes. They can be, a whole naturally formed huge island-like feature. It can be just a cluster of shores that could be submerged at high tide, or it could simply be just something you could never see. That is what we call a seabed rise, for example, that is always submerged, but nonetheless it is a claim because of resource rights, for example, something to do with seabed mineral resources, something to do with seabed hydrocarbons. But in recent times, most of the disputes we are looking at in the South China Sea concern rights, so meaning the coastal states' rights in accordance to international maritime law that entitles them to, for example, hydrocarbon resources and fishery resources.
China's claims in the South China Sea have been usually referred to as the Nine Dash Line. Could you explain the term to us?
So this is a set of rather vaguely defined lines that were drawn on a late 1940s map that belonged to then the Republic of China, which is what Taiwan wants to call itself. It used to be the legitimate seat of Chinese government back then under then President Chiang Kai-shek. So it was during then that the map was first known, but it was only later in the more modern times published as a maritime map of China that sort of formed the basis of China's claims to the South China Sea. But the issue here with the Nine Dash Line is, one, there are no clear geographical datum or coordinates that were being identified to sort of allow the other countries to properly define the real limits of the line. If anything, if you look at the various Chinese maps that were being published and you put them to the same scale and you try to overlay them on top of each other, it's clear that the lines do change arbitrarily. So in a way, it does also relate to the drafter of the map back then in the 1940s, where the line wasn't drawn exactly with a scientific method, right? So it was drawn arbitrarily, and thereby it continued to be arbitrary to this day. Some of the maps actually had not just a 9-dash line, it is a 10-dash line. So they actually had a 10th dash on the map that fully covered Taiwan. So this line is up up to this point, still an issue of contention, despite the fact that the line has been invalidated by the arbitral award in 2016. It still remains China's basis, even though China hasn't been talking very much about it recently. But in terms of the actions that we saw, in terms of the basis of the activities that were undertaken, it's clear that the 9-line claim continues to be alive. The one issue that I believe will be of concern to many of the other countries would be for China to clarify what exactly it is claiming within the 9-line. If we put aside the issue of geographical datum, right, and just simply ask the question, what is China trying to claim? There are two schools of thought. One is China is claiming just simply everything within the 9-line and nothing more than that. So it means the waters and the terrestrial features within and nothing more than outside the 9-line. And of course, which also means that the 9-line claims will also encompass the exclusive economic zone claims of the other Southeast Asian countries. And so the second school of thought is China is simply just claiming the terrestrial features within the 9-line. And some of the legal experts had the view that this second approach might actually benefit China more, because basically if you just simply sort of outline the maritime entitlements from each of these features, the claims in totality might actually exceed whatever that the 9-line encompasses in the South China Sea. So it could be actually more advantageous for China. But even to this day, China has not yet clearly specified what it's trying to claim within the 9-line, and it has been a rather vexing issue to the international community, both political, academic, as well as legal.
Why has the dispute escalated dramatically over the past decade?
The thing is, in the past decades, there have been some very important changes. One very important change has been the advent of the international maritime law. In particular, we are talking about the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Seas. So UNCLOS itself, which was promulgated in 1982, was subsequently ratified by a number of regional countries, including those that rim the South China Sea. Basically, what UNCLOS gives those coastal states are, as I mentioned earlier, the various entitlements to the maritime zones, and in that regard, their access to the resources therein. And of course, the maritime entitlement do cover some of those terrestrial features that you can find in the South China Sea, thereby touching on the issue of sovereignty as well. So this has been a key motivation amongst the various countries in the South China Sea. So that is the legal driver of the spike in the South China Sea disputes, especially since the end of the Cold War. Around 1990s onwards, there's been a sort of a brew up of the disputes. The other one has a lot to do with political and economy. So we're talking about in the 1990s, when the various countries around the region, they are embarking and continuing with their drive for industrialization and trying to keep up with socio-economic development, and therefore turning to the seas for resources as a way to sustain their development has become increasingly important. So that also sort of explains why regional countries are keen to look at developing their maritime economy around that time. And the other thing is military strategic. In large part, has a lot to do with China, where in the past, countries that had always been looking at, during the Cold War era, threats that emanate on land, so land-based threats largely, and threats that deal largely with internal security, they have started to look outward and regard seaward defense as increasingly more important, especially given the era of long-range weapons. So these factors actually combine and could help to explain why regional countries around the South China Sea were increasingly keen on the South China Sea, and thereby, as their activities intensify, their friction in terms of their interests also start to intensify. And that is what made us reach this current stage today.
You mentioned some of the actions that the various claimant states have been doing. So, what specifically has China been doing, and what has been the US response to this?
Okay, this is the very important context to put for. I'm glad you asked this question because if anything, the media tends to portray China as doing things that are pretty unique in the South China Sea. It is a bit more nuanced than that. We talk about the land reclamation activities, the various militarization activities that are popularly being talked about in the media. Much of the limelight has been on China for some good reason that I will touch on later. But to give a context, various parties within the South China Sea, they do actually engage in these activities over the decades. I mean, talk about the 1970s, 1980s, all the way until the 1990s. Various claimants have actually engaged in these activities. What made China stand out has been the scale of these activities by comparison. The land reclamation, the extent of destruction of the marine ecosystem, and the expanse of those features that we are looking at, those artificial islands that I'm talking about, replete with runways, ports, and a host of various infrastructure that can find on these features. They dwarf whatever the other claimants have built to date in the South China Sea. So these are the activities that mainly China had engaged in largely around 2014 up till 2016. And in the recent times, there have been no new land reclamation that has been made, but there are still incremental improvement and enhancement of those existing outposts in the Spratly Islands, as well as the adjacent Paracel Islands. So these activities drew the attention of the international community, in particular the United States. And in large part, much of the recent incidences that we saw in the South China Sea had their origins to the 2012 Scarborough Shoal incident, during the time when the Chinese Coast Guard intervened in the Philippine Navy's law enforcement activities against Chinese fishermen operating within the shore that is located within the Philippine exclusive economic zone. So after which there had been a whole spate of other incidences that concern the Filipinos and involving Chinese blockading of Filipino outposts in the Spratlys, and thereby help to fuel continued interest in the area, and thereby also American interest as well. So with Trump administration coming to picture back in early 2017, after he actually took office, there had been a spate of what we call freedom of navigation operations, largely US Navy operations that are intended to challenge so-called excessive maritime claims that China had engaged in, which will be in violation of the Permanent Court arbitration proceedings back in 2016, the award that was being handed down as a result of the lawsuit that was lodged by Manila against China back in 2013 after the Scarborough Shoal incident. So these activities had been, in a way, seen as a spate of posturing, counter-posturing between China and the US. There are, of course, concerns about whether there will be conflict between the two. But so far, whatever we have seen, the activities that are conducted by both sides have been underneath the threshold of armed conflict. But the only question is, will there be any potential escalatory actions that could be undertaken that might lead to that stage? But so far, given the Biden administration coming into the picture and some more conciliatory tone from the Biden administration towards the broader relationship with China, these prospects seem to be slightly reduced at least. But we still see more or less Biden still largely maintaining the same policy towards the South China Sea in continuation from the previous administration.
The majority of the South China Sea claimant states, ASEAN members, you have written previously about ASEAN's lack of unity in the dispute. What are some of the reasons for this?
Well, it's very important. I mean, you have to understand that ASEAN as a regional institution is made up of basically 10 very diverse, very different member states. they have very different levels of development, varying national interests in consequence, and therefore also very different prioritization of what they will do to secure those national interests. And basically, you might want to generally divide Southeast Asia, amongst the 10 ASEAN countries into two camps. One is what we call the maritime camp. The other one is mainland Southeast Asian camp. And largely those that belong to the latter camp, such as Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, they tend to have very little interest in the South China Sea. Their interests have been land-based. They are terrestrial security interests that they are talking about. These interests that deal with developmental security more than maritime security. So therefore, in the grander scheme of things, to them, the South China Sea dispute is nothing more than just a nuisance. It is nothing more than just at least a distraction. So they will rather prioritize their developmental interests with China and not try to imperil them. So when it comes to the grouping of ASEAN countries talking about the South China Sea, it is inevitable that some of these countries like Cambodia and Laos, they would not be as interested in highlighting China's coercion in the South China Sea. They are not even prepared to call out China's coercion in the South China Sea because of those larger, broader, mainly economics-based interests with Beijing. So, and then if you talk about just simply the maritime Southeast Asian countries, and that includes the non-claimant states like Singapore, for example, the fact that I do mention that there are non-claimant states within goes to show that even amongst the maritime Southeast Asian countries, there are differences as well, where even though they generally all agree that freedom of navigation and overflight is very vital for the economic well-being of the region at large. But when it comes to how they look at the dispute itself, they differ significantly in terms of how they should approach it. Some will prefer it to be bilateral in terms of one-to-one discussion or negotiation with Beijing to resolve the problems. Some of the member states, they prefer it to be multilateral. So they want to use or to leverage ASEAN as a bloc to try to counter China in the negotiation and try to maximize the benefits therein. So there are these differences within ASEAN in terms of their interests, in terms of the way they want to approach the South China Sea dispute. So therefore, it is not surprising that we not be able to see a united ASEAN beyond the issuance of joint statements that largely talk about generic norms, like things that are not unfamiliar to ASEAN, and any ASEAN watcher mentioned about the use of international law and not to resort to use of threat of force and peaceful settlement. All these are very generic statements that everyone will agree on. But what is not being reflected in the joint statements that come out of ASEAN has been the very different interests that each member state has and how they should approach or strategize in terms of how they want to resolve the issues.
Now, one of the things that ASEAN states and China have been negotiating is this proposed code of conduct to avoid confrontations between the two parties. Is there any chance that this code of conduct will ever materialize, or is it just a stalling tactic?
Especially in the 1990s, when, especially after the Mischief Reef incident between the Philippines and China, there had been already discussions about having a code of conduct. And of course, subsequent processes that were being embarked upon between ASEAN and China led to a watered-down version, what they call the Declaration of Parties on Conduct in South China Sea. So this is promulgated in November 2002, and basically is just a set of norms that somewhat lay out what are the things that ASEAN member states and China should and should not do in the South China Sea without any prescriptive provisions and not even anything that concern enforcement or verification. So these actually have been seen as at least a stepping stone towards an eventual code of conduct. But since 2002, and especially from 2010 and 2012, after the Scarborough Shoal incident, there had been, these talk that the idea of code of conduct is largely not going to materialize because China may just simply drag its foot on this process, that China might be using it as a stalling tactic. But then again, to be fair, for some of the other claimant states in the South China Sea, it could also be a stalling tactic because by and large, some of their interests are not necessarily in divergence from China's. And that largely pertain to the freedom to deploy forces and the freedom to embark on certain activities that they deem they want to per national interest in the South China Sea. So to some of them, at least, the code of conduct is seen as potentially constraining their freedom of action. So that is also the reason why China and some of the countries may not be as enthusiastic over the past 1 decade or so on the code of conduct until very recently. With the handing down of the arbitral award in July 2016 on the South China Sea, China appeared to have a much greater interest in pushing for the code of conduct negotiations. At least what we could observe is the attempt to try to keep out external interference, and that is a key motive of Beijing. And of course, one way is to highlight that it is keen to move on with peaceful management and solution on the South China Sea dispute with the other ASEAN rivals, and in some ways, it's an attempt to try to sideline that 2016 arbitral award. So there are actually real reasons why China will want to put renewed or reinvigorated emphasis on the code of conduct. The next question that we ask is one thing to talk about having a reinvigorated process on the code of conduct, but is it a stalling tactic? At the end, is it something like a road to nowhere, or is it going to be just a continuous journey forever? The verdict is out there. The timeline is an issue. We can be quite sure that this year might be a little bit challenging for them because of the COVID-19 that had delayed negotiations last year. So there might be delays in that. But there are reasons for China and ASEAN to want to have the code. For China, it is largely meant to be an instrument that can justify keeping out external interference. For ASEAN, it is a way to demonstrate that ASEAN as a bloc continues to be relevant and it is central to the regional architecture. And this is largely in response to criticisms that ASEAN has always been a top shot and unable to handle thorny issues like the South China Sea. My main question isn't so much about whether it's a stalling tactic, but what form that the code is going to take. Is it going to be a fully embodied instrument that could really constrain activities that could be deemed as detrimental to South China Sea peace and stability, or is it going to be just simply just a suboptimal instrument that basically is nothing more than the 2002 DOC that simply isn't prescriptive and doesn't contain teeth to handle violations?
So far, we've been discussing direct actions by state parties. Now, one of the new and increasingly prominent parties that are involved in confrontations in the South China Sea are Chinese fishing fleets. So could you explain more about their role in the conflict?
It is important. Whereas some of the Chinese scholars will argue that Chinese fishermen are just nothing more than fishermen. However, it misses a point that when you have fishing activities in an area, basically you are demonstrating some form of administration. You're basically just, demonstrating some form of stamping or imprint in the area that could later justify or legitimize your claim. So that is the important starting point we have to look at. And this, of course, ties in with one of the earlier bases of China's claim, and that pertains to historic rights that China claimed that it enjoys since the ancient times for the fishermen, with the argument that long time ago, Chinese fishermen had been operating as far south into, say, what is right now, North Natuna Sea of Indonesia. So therefore, it is deemed as a historic fishing right for Chinese fishermen, something that shouldn't be taken away. So because of that, China has been subsidizing the fishermen, especially those that are arrayed around the southern coast of mainland China, in Hainan in particular. And these fishermen, they are able to enjoy those government subsidies in terms of fuel, in terms of the installation of high-tech satellite tracking systems and communication systems, and more importantly perhaps is the construction of large ocean-going steel hull fishing vessels that can allow them to go as far south as possible in the South China Sea to carry out those activities, and thereby, sort of putting in their imprints in the South China Sea. And in some ways, the other Southeast Asian fishermen, they do feel intimidated because on the one hand, they do not have the clout of the Chinese fishing fleet. Chinese fishing fleet tends to be very large, especially during fishing season. It will be about hundreds of fishing vessels in the fleet swarming out into the South China Sea, carrying out various fishing and harvesting activities. And their ships tend to be larger, and they tend to crowd out or sideline other fishing vessels. A good example here would be Vietnam. The long-standing complaint is that Vietnam has been increasingly crowded out by Chinese fishing fleets from the waters that they used to operate in the South China Sea, and thereby resulting in what we call the blue boat phenomenon we saw in the South Pacific, where Vietnamese fishing vessels have been apprehended for illegal fishing. And the argument that Hanoi tends to have is that because they can't do fishing activities in the South China Sea due to the overwhelming Chinese fishing presence, thereby they'll have to find alternative fishing ground. So this is likely not just confined to the Vietnamese, because in the North Natuna Sea, Indonesian fishermen were complaining about the same thing, whereby there are smaller boats and there are smaller groups that they operate together tend to be sort of overshadowed by the Chinese. So thereby, it creates a certain problem for the rest. And by the extension, if you have fishing vessels that operate out in the South China Sea, they do require escort. So it does give a legitimized reason for the Chinese to provide armed escort for the fishermen. And that comes in the form largely of coast guards that will escort the fishing vessels and to try to intervene or counter-intervene in the law enforcement activities by the other Southeast Asian rivals in the South China Sea, and thereby helping in some way undermine the claims or the rights of the other claimants in the South China Sea. So this is why the fishing fleet, the fishing activities are so important in helping us understand the ongoing South China Sea disputes recently.
As you mentioned before, Singapore is not a claimant state in the South China Sea dispute. So why should Singaporeans care about the status of the dispute and the new developments in the area?
It is important from two fronts. First of all is, as you mentioned, Singapore isn't a claimant to the South China Sea dispute, but Singapore nonetheless has a direct sort of maritime approach into the South China Sea. Of course, it has to go through neighboring waters in order to get into the South China Sea. But at the very most basic, Singapore is a maritime nation. It depends on seaborne trade for its prosperity and for its survival. So by and large, freedom of navigation and overflight through the South China Sea, ensuring safe and secure access to the sea routes in the South China Sea is important for Singapore's well-being. So that is the most basic sort of underpinning reason why Singapore should be concerned about the South China Sea dispute. Any such contingency that will see the South China Sea dispute erupting into armed conflict isn't to Singapore's economic and strategic interests. The other angle to look at, which is not very much looked at until very recently, is the broader geopolitical strategic implications for Singapore, because it does concern the viability of ASEAN as an institution. And second, also, it concerns the viability of the US military and security presence in the region. I'll touch on each one in more detail. The first one that I mentioned about is ASEAN as an institution. Singapore's foreign policy cornerstone has been to ensure that ASEAN remains viable, it remains relevant, it remains central to the regional architecture. If the South China Sea dispute isn't managed properly, or if there is an armed conflict emanating from the South China Sea, it does have a direct impact on ASEAN's credibility, and thereby it does have a certain impact on Singapore's foreign policy principles that are in large part premised on keeping ASEAN buoyant as an institution. So that is one. And the second is that Singapore has always regarded the US as a primary security partner. And on the count that the US remains seen as a primary provider of peace and stability in the region. So this so-called offshore balancing role dated from especially the post-Cold War till now, and it continues to be seen in this light. So if there is the event where the South China Sea dispute goes out of control, and it does have certain ramification on US military presence in the region, and it will have a direct ramification on Singapore's national security as well. So a good example here is when the US started to vacate from the Philippines in the early 1990s, because the US used to have bases in the Philippines, and Singapore offered access to its military facilities as a way to keep the US engaged. And if you look at it in the same lens today, there are also concerns that the ongoing problems between the Philippines and the US and has a relation with the South China Sea does have a direct impact on Singapore, because there will be questions about the future viability of US defense posture in the region.